In this video, we're going to start talking about properties of parallelograms with their sides and angles. So the first four properties we're going to talk about with parallelograms are that opposite sides of a parallelogram are parallel, opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent, opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent, and consecutive angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. So maybe pause the video and write those down. All right, and then we're going to continue on and look at this graphic organizer of quadrilaterals. So quadrilaterals are polygons with four sides and four angles. And notice parallelograms in our middle bubble here. They are quadrilaterals that have two pairs of parallel sides and their opposite sides are congruent. And notice underneath there we have rectangles, squares, and rhombuses. That means that rectangles and squares and rhombuses are all parallelograms. And we'll talk a little more about those in another lesson. And then notice kites have no parallel sides and trapezoids only have one pair of parallel sides. So they are not included underneath the umbrella of parallelograms. And again, we're going to talk about those later in another lesson. Okay, so let's draw our parallelogram properties on this graphic organizer just to get a better idea of what this looks like. So opposite sides are parallel. Let's write that one down again. Opposite sides are parallel. So that means that this pair of opposite sides are parallel. We put an arrow on each one to represent that those are parallel to one another. And then these opposite sides on the left and right would also be parallel. So they need to have two arrows because they're parallel to one another, but they're not parallel to the ones that I wrote in blue. So that's our first property of parallelograms. Let's do another one. Opposite sides are congruent. And let's draw what that would look like. So opposite sides, like the top and the bottom, are congruent. So we put a tick mark to represent that those are congruent. And then the left and the right are also congruent. So put two tick marks to represent that they are congruent to one another, but they are not congruent to the top and the bottom. Okay, so let's look at the next property. We have opposite angles are congruent. Write that down. Oop. Okay, so that would look like opposite angles would be this angle, and the one opposite is across the parallelogram. Let me just draw that a little better. You can either leave it like that, or you can put a tick mark in that little angle symbol. And then these other angles that are opposite of one another are also congruent. So you can either put two angle marks, or you could have put two tick marks. Either one, but you don't have to write both of those. But they're both ways to indicate that angles are congruent to one another. So like we'll just leave this one like that. And then the last property we wrote down was that consecutive angles are supplementary. All right, and so supplementary means that they add up to 180. Consecutive means they're beside each other. And so that would mean, like if this is angle A, B, C, and D, we would say that angle A plus angle B add up to 180. I'm going to try to write this out here. So I'll just write it at the top. Angle A plus angle B would equal 180. But also angle, let's see, B and C. Those are consecutive because they're beside each other. So let's write angle B plus angle C would also equal 180. I'm going to put the little degree symbol on there. And let's continue around the figure for a minute. So D and C are also beside each other. They would also add up to 180. Ooh, sorry. So let's get my pen and write that down. So angle D plus angle C equals 180. And then we have one more pair that are consecutive. So let's use orange. So if we have A, that's also beside angle D, those would also be supplementary. So angle A plus angle D would also add up to 180. So any pair that is beside each other in a parallelogram add up to 180. So consecutive means this like one after the other. All right, so you can pause this video if you feel like you're comfortable with those properties and try these examples on your own and then continue watching, or you can just continue watching and we'll go over them together. All right, so example 1 gives us this parallelogram with the angles labeled, and we're just going to use our properties of parallelograms to find the values of x and y. So the first thing I notice is 2x is opposite of the 70 degrees, and I know that opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. So I'm going to put 2x is equal to 70. We can just divide by 2, and we get x equals 35. All right, and then if I know that x equals 35, I can use that to help me figure out y, because notice you have x and y in this angle. So we would need to figure out x first before we're able to go and figure out the y value. So I'm going to say 3 times 35 plus 5, because now I know x equals 35. So that would be 105 plus 5 is 110 degrees, which I also know that because of the 70 that is right here, because those are supplementary. They add up to 180 because they're consecutive. So there's a couple ways that you know that that angle needs to be 110 degrees. But then you also know opposite angles are congruent. So we could say 110 degrees would equal x plus 3y. We know x equals 35, so we can go ahead and plug that in and just finish solving for y. So let's subtract 35. So I would have 75 is equal to 3y, and then we just need to divide by 3. I'm going to bring it over here so I don't take up room in another example. So 75 divided by 3, 3y divided by 3 gives me 25. So y equals 25. I was just moving that out of the way of that example. And we found x equals 35. All right, let's take a look at this example. Example 2 has the sides of the parallelogram labeled. Notice these are not angles, these are sides. And so what we know about their sides is that opposite sides are parallel, but that won't help us solve this problem. But we also know that they're congruent. And so I'm going to just set these equal to one another and these left and right sides equal to one another. And I'm going to solve for x and y by setting them equal. So 5x equals 3x plus 18. I can subtract 3x and I get 2x equals 18. Divide by 2 and we can get x equals 9. And then the top and the bottom are also congruent. So 3y minus 7 equals 2y plus 4. We can subtract 2y. So we get y minus 7 equals 4. And just add the 7. And you get y equals 11. All right, so that's it for number 2. So number 3, notice they've labeled the angles again. So you want to think of properties that involve your angles. So opposite angles are congruent is a nice quick way to get started usually. So I can tell 120 degrees would be the measure of angle Z. So that's pretty quick and easy since they're opposite of one another. And then what I would do is say these two angles are supplementary because they're consecutive. They're right beside each other. So you can say that 120, if I subtract that from 180, I get 60 degrees. So this angle is 60 degrees, and I know that part of it is equal to 35 degrees. So I could say 60 minus 35 leaves me with 25 degrees for the value of x. Okay, so if we know x is 25 degrees, z was 120 degrees. We also know that triangles always add up to 180 degrees. So that will help us figure out the value of y. So y would be 180 degrees minus 120 minus the 25 degrees, which would be 35 degrees. So now we have figured out all of our variables, x, y, and z. Let's move on to number 4. So notice number 4 has labeled angles again. You just always want to check, is it labeling the angles or the sides to make sure you treat them properly. So I can tell quickly again, 80 is across from the x. That's always an easy way to get started with a figure, is pick out opposite angles. So x would quickly just equal 80 degrees based on that property. Opposite angles are congruent. Then what I would say is z is opposite of this angle that's sitting beside the y. So they are going to be related once I figure out what y is equal to. Z is also beside 80 degrees, and that means they're consecutive. And consecutive angles are supplementary, so if this angle equals 80, z would have to equal 100 degrees. Then I can put 100 degrees right beside that y, and y and the 100 degrees are a linear pair. So the y would have to equal 80 because a linear pair is always supplementary. Not 180, just 80. Okay, so we've got x, y, and z. I think we have one more example. Nope, we have two more. So let's look at number 5. Find the measure of angle G. So notice they've labeled the angles with some algebra. So let's solve. Based on the properties of a parallelogram, we know these are opposite angles and they are therefore congruent. So let's say 3x plus 11 is equal to 5x minus 9. So we need to first solve for x. So I'm just going to subtract 3x. I get 2x minus 9 equals 11. Let's add 9. So we get 20 equals 2x. And then divide both sides by 2. And so we get x equals 10. But that is not the answer to the question because they asked you to find the measure. That's what that little m stands for, the measure of angle G. So you just need to plug it back in. Now really those are equal to each other, so it really doesn't matter which one you plug it back into. So since it asked for the measure of angle G, I'm just going to go ahead and say 5 times 10 minus 9. But I just want you to notice that 3 times 10 plus 11 will give us the same amount. So 30 plus 11 would give us 41. 5 times 10 is 50. And 50 minus 9 is also equal to 41, which is just a good check that you've got everything correct in the problem. All right, now the last example is a good one because it doesn't draw a parallelogram for us. We need to draw the parallelogram ourselves. So it says ABCD is a parallelogram. So sketch what kind of looks like a leaning rectangle on your paper. And then you always want to label it going around the figure. So if I start with A in this upper left corner, then I want to go around the figure to label it. You don't want to just put them anywhere. You want to say if that's A, this is B, then C, and then D. So you can start in any corner, but then you would just need to go around the figure to label it. Don't go zigzag and put like A across from B, for example. All right, so enough of that. Let's look at what we have here. Angle A is 110 degrees. And it just wants us to figure out the measure of angles B, C, and D if we know angle A is 110. So if we know angle A is 110 degrees, that simple property I've been mentioning before is that opposite angles are congruent. So we would know that angle C is also, and I'm going to put the measure of angle C so you see that again. The measure of angle C is 110 degrees. That's what that little M stands for. And then B, I'll just start with that one, is consecutive to angle A because they're right beside each other in the figure in our parallelogram. And so 180 degrees minus 110 would leave us with 70 degrees for angle B. So I'm going to write the measure of angle B is 70 degrees. And then B is opposite of angle D, so those are congruent. So the measure of angle D would also equal 70 degrees. All right, so that's it for these notes. Thank you for listening.